The sun was just beginning to rise over the Arizona desert, painting the sky with shades of gold and soft pink. The air was still cool, but everyone who lived in the desert knew the heat would soon come. The kind that made even the lizards hide under rocks. On a small piece of land far from the nearest town stood a tiny wooden house. It wasn't fancy or large, but it was sturdy and clean. This was the home of Eli Turner, a man who had long ago made peace with the quiet life of solitude. Eli was in his early 50s, tall and lean from years of hard work. His hands were rough, his face weathered by the sun, and his blue eyes had a softness that spoke of patience and sorrow. Every morning before the heat arrived, he would rise with the sun, feed his 2 cows, check his crops, and fetch water from the well behind his barn. He didn't rush through anything. He moved with calm purpose, like a man who had learned that life on the frontier rewarded patience more than speed. Years ago, Eli had come to Arizona with dreams of starting a family and owning his own land. He had married a kind woman named Mary, and for a while their days were full of hope. They had planted fruit trees, built their home with their own hands, and even planned to raise children. But life in the desert was not easy. The land was dry, the rains were rare, and sickness could come without warning. One winter, a fever swept through the small settlement nearby. Mary fell ill and never recovered. Eli buried her under the big cottonwood tree behind their house, the one that still stood strong and green, even in the dry season. After that, Eli's world became quiet. He no longer sang to himself while working, and he didn't go to town much. People knew him as the lonely farmer, the man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. Still, no one had a bad word to say about him. When someone needed help fixing a wagon or pulling a stuck mule out of the mud, Eli would show up with his tools and a kind smile. He didn't talk much, but his actions always spoke for him. His nearest neighbors lived miles away, and the only sounds he usually heard were the calls of coyotes at night and the wind brushing through the dry grass. Sometimes, as he sat by the fire after supper, Eli would take out a small wooden box. Inside was a faded photograph of Mary, her smile still bright despite the years. He would look at it for a long time, as if speaking to her in silence. "You'd laugh if you saw me now, Mary," he'd whisper, still talking to the chickens and arguing with the well pump. Despite the loneliness, Eli found comfort in the rhythm of his days. The land gave him purpose. He knew every inch of it, where the wildflowers grew after the rain, where the rabbits liked to hide, and where the creek sometimes flowed in spring. There was peace in knowing the land so well. Still, deep inside, he felt an emptiness that even the wide-open sky couldn't fill. The nearest town, Dry Creek, was a half-day's ride away. Once every few weeks, Eli would hitch up his old mule, Daisy, and head there to trade eggs, milk, or dried beans for supplies. The folks at the general store liked him well enough. Mr. Hanson, the storekeeper, always greeted him with a friendly wave. "Morning, Eli. You bringin' me the best butter in the county again?" he'd say with a grin. Eli would smile a little and answer, "Only if you've got the best coffee in return." That was about the extent of his small talk. Children sometimes peeked at him shyly from behind their mother's skirts. To them, he seemed like a figure out of a story, the quiet man from the desert who lived all alone. Some said he talked to the stars. Others whispered that he could make a garden grow even in the driest soil. Eli would just tip his hat to them and head home before the sun dipped too low. Back on his land, the days passed slowly but steadily. Eli spent much of his time repairing fences, checking the roof, or tending to his small vegetable patch. In spring, he planted beans and corn. Though the ground was hard and stubborn, he had learned how to work with it, coaxing life from the soil with care. When the crops sprouted, he felt a quiet pride. "We're still in this fight, Mary," he'd say softly, standing in the field with his hat in his hands. Sometimes travelers passed through his land, cowboys, trappers, or wandering families heading west. Eli would offer water, maybe a bit of shade, but he never asked many questions. He respected the silence of others because he knew what it was like to carry things that couldn't be easily spoken. One evening, as the sun melted behind the mountains, Eli sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. The desert stretched out before him, endless and golden. In the distance, a few wisps of smoke rose from the hills, a sign that the Apache tribes were camping nearby again. He had seen them before, always from a distance. The settlers in town often spoke nervously about them, but Eli didn't share their fear. He believed that people were just people, all trying to survive in a hard land. He kept to his side and they kept to theirs. That was enough for peace. Still, he sometimes wondered about them, about their way of life, their families, and what they thought of the land they called home long before settlers arrived. He felt a quiet respect for their endurance. It took strength to live in this desert, and he could see that strength in every Apache rider who crossed the horizon with calm confidence. That night, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant drums. Eli leaned back in his chair and listened. The rhythm was deep and steady, echoing across the canyons. It was strange, but instead of feeling uneasy, he felt comforted. It was like the heartbeat of the land itself, steady, ancient, alive. He smiled faintly, finished his coffee and whispered to the stars, "Guess even the desert has its music." The next morning came bright and clear. Eli rose early, as always, and set out to check his fence line along the creek. The sun warmed his back as he walked, and the scent of wild sage filled the air. Everything seemed ordinary, just another quiet day. But something in his heart felt different, a slight stirring, as if life was holding its breath, waiting. He didn't know it yet, but this was the day everything would change. Far to the south, hidden among the canyons, a small group of Apache riders was moving quickly through the desert. One of them was a young boy, brave, curious, and far too daring for his age. His name was Little Hawk, the only son of Chief Greyhawk, leader of one of the most respected Apache bands. The boy had wandered away from camp earlier that morning, chasing a wild Mustang that had caught his eye. He didn't know how far he had gone until the ground beneath his horse gave way on the edge of a dried riverbed. As Eli walked along the fence, he paused. There, faint, almost hidden by the wind, came a sound. A cry, sharp and frightened, carried over the canyon. He stopped, listening closely. Again it came, a voice young and desperate. Without a second thought, Eli began to walk faster, following the sound toward the dry creek. His boots kicked up dust and his heart beat a little faster. It wasn't often that someone called for help out here. He couldn't see yet who it was or what had happened, but something inside told him that this moment, this call for help in the middle of nowhere, would mark the beginning of a story that would change his quiet life forever. And so, the lonely farmer took his first steps toward a meeting that would bring the past, the present, and two worlds together, not through conflict, but through kindness. The sound came again, faint but clear this time. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was a voice young and frightened. Eli Turner stopped beside a mesquite tree, his heart beating faster. The desert was quiet except for the whisper of the wind and the rustle of dry grass. Then the cry echoed once more, floating up from somewhere beyond the dry creek bed. Eli didn't waste a moment. He climbed down the slope carefully, his boots crunching against loose stones. The sun was rising higher now and the air was growing hot. When he reached the bottom, he saw a small cloud of dust and beneath it, something moving. He hurried closer and soon realized it was a horse tangled awkwardly near a fallen log. Next to it lay a boy, no older than 12, his leg trapped under the animal's side. Eli's heart tightened. "Easy there," he said softly, his voice calm and kind, the same tone he used when talking to frightened animals. The boy's eyes widened. He was clearly Apache, his dark hair tied loosely, his clothes worn from travel, and a string of beads around his neck. His face was pale with pain, and fear flashed in his eyes when he saw the stranger approaching. Eli raised his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "It's all right, son. I'm here to help you," he said gently. The boy didn't answer. He probably didn't understand English. He tried to move but gasped, gripping the ground tightly. The horse shifted a little, groaning softly. Eli knew he had to act quickly before the heat became unbearable. He spoke in a calm voice, half to the boy and half to himself. "We'll get you out from under there, all right? Just stay still." He found a sturdy branch and used it to lift part of the horse's saddle and shift its weight. With slow, steady pressure, he managed to roll the animal just enough for the boy to pull his leg free. The moment it came loose, the boy let out a breath of relief. Eli sat back, wiping the sweat from his brow. "See? You're safe now," he said, smiling. The boy didn't smile back, but his expression softened a little. Eli checked the leg carefully, swollen but not broken. He tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped it gently around the boy's ankle to keep it still. The horse was still alive, though exhausted. Eli gave it a little water from his canteen and then helped the boy sit up against a rock. "You'll be fine, son," he said. "We'll get you home." The boy looked at him quietly, studying his face. Then in a soft, uncertain voice, he spoke a single word in Apache. Eli didn't understand, but he could hear the gratitude in the tone. He nodded and patted the boy's shoulder. "You're welcome, kid. Let's get you out of this, son." He lifted the boy gently, carrying him across the creek bed and up toward his wagon path. The boy was light, but the climb was steep and Eli's breath came hard. Still, he didn't stop. When they reached the top, he placed the boy in the wagon's shade, gave him some water, and whistled for his mule. "Come on, Daisy, we've got company today." Daisy, the old gray mule, brayed softly and trotted over. Eli smiled as he secured the boy in the wagon, wrapping him with a blanket from behind the seat. The boy was quiet, eyes closed, clutching his necklace tightly. They began the slow ride back to the cabin. The wheels creaked, the desert stretched endlessly around them, and the boy dozed off now and then. Eli glanced at him every few minutes. "You must have family nearby," he murmured. "Don't worry, we'll find them." When they reached his small farm, the sun was high and the air shimmered with heat. Eli carried the boy inside and laid him on Mary's old bed, the softest place in the house. He fetched a bowl of cool water, washed the dust from the boy's face, and placed a damp cloth on his forehead. The boy watched him silently, his eyes full of cautious trust. Eli cooked a little soup from beans and wild herbs and offered it to him. The boy hesitated, then took a small sip. He seemed surprised by the taste. Maybe it wasn't what he was used to, but after a while he ate quietly. Eli smiled to himself. "That's it. Get your strength back." As the afternoon passed, Eli sat by the window, carving a small piece of wood into the shape of a horse. The boy's eyes followed the movement of the knife. When Eli noticed, he smiled and held out the half-carved figure. "See, like your horse," he said, showing it with a gentle gesture. The boy reached out shyly, touching it with his fingertips. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but only a whisper came out. Eli didn't press him. Sometimes words aren't needed. Kindness, Eli believed, spoke its own language. By evening, the desert sky turned orange and purple. Eli stepped outside to feed the animals. When he returned, the boy was asleep, breathing softly, his small hand still holding the wooden horse. The sight warmed Eli's heart. He covered him with another blanket, then sat quietly by the fire, thinking. He knew the boy's family would come looking for him, maybe by morning. He also knew that some settlers would be afraid to have Apaches near their homes. But Eli didn't share that fear. He had learned long ago that people were often afraid of what they didn't understand. He looked at the boy again and said softly, "You'll see your folks soon, little one. You just hold on." That night, the wind carried the soft hum of crickets and the faint rhythm of distant drums, the same sound he'd heard before. It was peaceful, almost like a lullaby. Eli leaned back in his chair and gazed into the fire, the orange glow lighting his thoughtful face. He thought of Mary. She would have done the same, taken in the boy without question. "You'd be proud of me tonight, Mary," he whispered. This old heart still got a little kindness left. Morning came quietly. The sun rose slow and golden over the horizon. Eli stepped outside to fetch water, and that's when he noticed something strange. Fresh hoofprints in the sand near the barn. They weren't from his mule. He followed them a few steps and then he froze. On the ridge, barely visible against the sky, stood 3 Apache riders. They didn't move, just watched. Eli raised a hand not in fear but in greeting. After a moment, the riders turned their horses and disappeared behind the hill. He felt a shiver of understanding. They knew where their boy was. Inside, the boy was awake, sitting up on the bed. He looked stronger now, and when Eli entered, he pointed toward the hills and said something in Apache, his tone filled with excitement. Eli nodded. "Yes, I saw them. Your people are near." He helped the boy outside to sit in the sunlight. The boy smiled for the first time, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He touched the wooden horse in his hand, then held it out to Eli as if to say thank you. Eli shook his head gently and pushed it back toward him. "It's yours, son. A memory for the road." For a moment, they just looked at each other, 2 souls from different worlds, brought together by chance and simple compassion. Then, in the distance, Eli saw dust rising again, a sign of riders approaching fast. He felt his heart steady. "Looks like your family's come for you," he said quietly. Let's get you ready." He didn't know who they were or how they would react to finding their boy in the care of a white farmer. But one thing was certain. Eli Turner had done what his heart told him was right. And sometimes, that's all a man can do. He gently placed his hat on his head, helped the boy stand, and waited by the fence. The wind brushed against them softly, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The boy held the wooden horse close to his chest. Glancing up at Eli one last time, neither of them spoke, but there was an understanding between them, quiet and strong, like the desert itself. Moments later, the first Apache riders appeared on the horizon, their horses gliding across the sand like shadows. The morning light gleamed on their long hair and bright beads. Eli's heart beat slow but calm. He didn't move, didn't hide. He simply stood beside the boy, ready to face whatever came next. He didn't yet know that this simple act of kindness, saving a stranger's son, would not only change his life, but would soon bring him more company than he ever imagined possible. The morning sun had climbed higher when Eli Turner saw the riders more clearly. The desert shimmered in the light, and in that brightness the figures moved like part of the landscape, calm, graceful, and steady. The boy beside him stood quietly, one hand resting on the fence for balance. His face lit up with relief, but Eli noticed the nervousness in his eyes too. The riders came closer, their horses trotting smoothly over the sandy ground. Eli counted at least 10 of them. They were dressed in soft deerskin, their hair long and tied with beads and feathers. Each carried a calm but watchful look, like people who knew how to read danger before it arrived. At their head rode a man older than the rest, tall, broad-shouldered, and proud. His face was strong, lined with wisdom, and his dark eyes seemed to hold the weight of many stories. Eli knew right away who he must be, the chief. The boy's hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward the man. "Father," he whispered in a soft, shaky voice. The word might have been in Apache, but Eli understood it perfectly. Eli felt something shift in his chest, a quiet mix of awe and respect. He stepped away from the fence, standing still beside the boy as the riders approached. His mule Daisy brayed softly and backed up a little, sensing the tension. But Eli stayed calm. His hands were open, his posture steady, his eyes kind. He didn't want them to think he was afraid, nor that he was a threat. The riders came to a halt a few yards away. Dust rose around them and sparkled in the sunlight. For a long moment no one spoke. Only the sound of the desert wind moved between them. The chief dismounted slowly, his movements graceful but firm. He walked toward Eli, every step measured, his gaze never leaving the man who stood before him. Eli's heart thumped quietly. He didn't move. When the chief stopped just a few feet away, the boy limped forward, his face breaking into a smile. The chief knelt immediately, his strong hands gently touching the boy's face, his shoulders, his leg. He spoke to him in quick, low tones. The boy answered softly, his eyes shining. Then, to Eli's surprise, the chief turned his gaze toward him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The chief's eyes were deep and unreadable, but Eli saw something in them, gratitude mixed with caution. The chief looked around, at the small cabin, the horse tied near the barn, the tracks in the dust that told the story of the rescue. Then he looked back at Eli as if to ask a silent question. "Why did you help my son?" Eli, sensing that silence needed no fancy words, simply said, "He was hurt. I couldn't leave him." His voice was calm and respectful, his tone humble but steady. He pointed toward the cabin. He needed rest. "I gave him food and water. That's all." The chief didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the boy again, who nodded eagerly and began speaking in his own language. His words came quickly, his small hands moving as if he were reliving the moment when Eli saved him. Eli could not understand the language, but he didn't need to. The emotion was clear enough. Gratitude, trust, relief. When the boy finished, the chief slowly nodded. He stood tall again and placed a hand on his heart. Then he said a few words in Apache, his voice deep and strong. One of the younger riders stepped forward and translated softly. He says, "You are friend. Brother to his people," he says. "You saved his only son." Eli's throat tightened. He wasn't used to being called brother by anyone. For years he had lived in silence, speaking only to the wind and the animals. To hear those words now, spoken with such sincerity, filled him with quiet warmth. The chief took another step forward and held out his hand, palm open. Eli hesitated for a moment, then placed his own rough, calloused hand against it. The chief gripped it firmly, not in the way of strangers making peace, but like two men who shared mutual respect. The boy smiled widely now, his earlier fear completely gone. He turned and spoke again to his father, who listened and nodded. Then the chief gestured toward the camp in the hills, pointing eastward. He seemed to be inviting Eli to come. Eli smiled gently and shook his head. "Thank you, but I'll stay here. My work's on this land." The chief studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. He seemed to understand that this quiet man belonged to the earth beneath his feet, that he was not someone who sought reward or recognition. He simply did what was right. Before leaving, the chief reached into a small pouch on his belt and pulled out a necklace of turquoise stones. The stones glowed softly in the morning light. He held it out to Eli. The younger rider translated again. "Gift," he said. "Token of thanks. You keep it." Eli looked at the necklace in surprise. It was beautiful, clearly something valuable to them. He hesitated, unsure if he should take it. "I didn't do it for this," he said quietly. The boy stepped forward, took Eli's hand, and gently placed the necklace into his palm. His small fingers closed Eli's hand around it, then pressed his own hand over Eli's heart. That simple gesture spoke louder than any words. Eli swallowed hard, feeling emotion rise in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. "He's a fine boy. You raise him well." The translator relayed the words, and the chief's expression softened into something that looked almost like a smile. The riders turned their horses to leave, but before mounting, the chief placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. He said something in Apache, his tone firm but warm. The translator hesitated, as if unsure how to express the meaning. He says, "You will never be alone again." Eli blinked, not quite understanding what that meant, but nodded politely. "I appreciate that," he said with a faint smile. The chief nodded once more, then mounted his horse with graceful ease. The boy waved from where he sat on another horse, holding the small wooden carving Eli had given him. He pointed to it, then to Eli, smiling brightly. Eli raised his hand in return, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years. Connection. As the riders disappeared into the golden horizon, a deep peace settled over the land. The only sound left was the creak of the fence and the soft whisper of the wind through the dry grass. When Eli went back inside, he sat down at the table and stared at the turquoise necklace in his hand. It shone like the desert sky after rain. He placed it gently beside Mary's old photograph and whispered, "You see that, Mary? Folks out here still know kindness." That evening, the desert was unusually quiet. Even the coyotes seemed to hold their song. Eli sat outside on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. He thought about the chief's words, "You will never be alone again." What could that mean? Perhaps it was a simple blessing, a wish for companionship. Or maybe it was something deeper, a promise that the kindness he had shown would someday return to him in unexpected ways. He leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "Well," he said aloud, "I reckon that's more than I deserve." The next morning the sun rose golden and soft over the mountains. Eli went about his chores as usual, feeding the chickens, fixing a broken gate, and watering the few green plants near his porch. But there was something different in the air, a quiet hum of anticipation. Even Daisy the mule seemed restless, flicking her ears and braying softly as if she sensed visitors coming. By midday the horizon shimmered again with movement. Not one rider this time, but many. Eli shaded his eyes, curious. Dust rose in thick waves. His heart began to beat a little faster. "Now what in the world?" he murmured. As the figures grew clearer, he recognized the chief again, and behind him a long procession of riders, women, and elders. Their colorful blankets shone in the sunlight, and their laughter carried faintly across the breeze. Eli blinked in disbelief. "That can't be," he whispered, taking off his hat. Whatever the chief had meant by his words, Eli was about to find out. And what awaited him on that bright Arizona afternoon was beyond anything he could have imagined, something that would change his quiet, lonely life forever. The day was bright and warm when Eli Turner saw the long line of riders approaching from the east. The sunlight bounced off the desert sand, making the air shimmer like golden glass. From a distance, it looked like a mirage, a colorful wave of motion and music carried by the wind. Eli shaded his eyes with one hand. Now what do we have here? He muttered softly. The scene felt almost unreal. The chief was at the front, riding with calm authority. Behind him followed a group of riders, men, women, and children, their horses decorated with feathers and bright fabrics that fluttered in the wind. He could hear the faint sound of singing, rhythmic and joyful. Eli's mule, Daisy, lifted her head and gave a curious bray. Even the animals seemed to feel that something unusual was happening. As the procession drew closer, Eli's curiosity turned to amazement. There were baskets carried on horses, colorful blankets tied behind saddles, and laughter that echoed through the desert like birdsong. When the riders reached the edge of his land, they slowed to a stop. Eli took off his hat politely and stepped forward. "Morning, Chief," he greeted, his voice steady but full of surprise. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Chief Greyhawk dismounted gracefully, his face calm but carrying a quiet smile. He spoke a few words in his language, and one of the younger men translated. "The chief comes to honor his brother," the man said proudly. "You saved his son. Today his people return your kindness." Eli blinked. "That wasn't necessary," he said quickly, feeling a little nervous. "The boy's safe, and that's all that matters." But the chief only smiled and shook his head, as if to say that gratitude wasn't a choice. It was a sacred duty. He lifted his hand and gave a short call. At once the group behind him parted. And then, to Eli's complete astonishment, 15 young women stepped forward, each dressed in beautiful traditional clothing with bright beads, ribbons, and braids shining in the sunlight. They stood in a neat line, graceful and quiet, their faces calm but curious as they looked at the tall farmer with his weathered hat and kind eyes. Eli's mouth fell open slightly. "Now hold on," he began, but the chief was already speaking again in a deep, powerful voice. The translator smiled broadly as he interpreted. "The chief says, a man who saves his son must never live alone again. He says these women are gifts of kinship. Each comes from a good family to bring you laughter, warmth, and company. You will never know loneliness again." For a few seconds, Eli was too stunned to speak. His eyes moved from one kind face to another. They weren't frightened or shy. They looked peaceful, even pleased to be part of something meaningful. But Eli's heart raced. He didn't know what to do with such an honor. "Chief," he said carefully, "I appreciate the kindness, truly, but I can't accept brides. I wouldn't know what to do with one, let alone 15. The translator repeated his words, and the group laughed gently, even the chief. The sound wasn't mocking. It was warm and friendly. The chief raised his hand again and spoke a few calm sentences. The translator smiled and said, "He says, you are humble. That is why his people respect you. You may choose your way. The gift is not just for marriage. It is for family, for friendship, for life shared. They will help you and keep your home full of life." Eli looked at the chief, touched and overwhelmed. I don't deserve all this," he said softly. The chief stepped closer and placed a firm hand on Eli's shoulder, speaking quietly in his native tongue. The translator's voice followed. He says, "When hearts are kind, the world grows better. You gave kindness. Now kindness returns." There was nothing Eli could say after that. His eyes glistened a little as he nodded. "Then let's make them welcome," he said. "All of them." The chief's people cheered and began to set up camp near the edge of Eli's land. Some women carried baskets filled with food, roasted corn, fruits, and freshly baked flatbread. Others began arranging colorful blankets in a circle near the cottonwood tree. Children ran around laughing, their bright laughter ringing through the warm afternoon. The scene was alive with joy, music, and the soft hum of voices. Eli hadn't seen this much life on his land in years. The place that once echoed only with the wind and the lowing of cows now felt like the heart of a festival. He moved among them, helping where he could, still unsure how to act but smiling nonetheless. A few of the women began cooking over a small fire, and the smell of roasting vegetables and spices filled the air. One of the younger women, perhaps no older than 20, approached Eli shyly, holding a woven basket filled with bread. She pointed to it and then to him, smiling brightly. "Eat," she said in careful English. Her accent was soft, musical. Eli grinned and accepted the bread. "Thank you," he said. "Smells better than anything I've made in months." She giggled, not understanding all his words but recognizing his tone. Then she motioned for him to sit, and soon a few others joined, sharing food and stories in broken English and laughter. It was simple, honest joy, something Eli hadn't felt in so long that it almost brought tears to his eyes. As evening settled over the desert, the chief called everyone together. The sky glowed pink and gold, and the first stars began to appear. The chief stood before the gathered group, his son by his side, and spoke with deep emotion. His words flowed like poetry in the Apache tongue, and though Eli understood little, the tone touched his heart. When the translator spoke, his voice was steady and warm. The chief says once a child of his people was lost and afraid. A stranger found him and gave him life again. Today, that stranger is no longer alone. Our tribes, our hearts are joined by the spirit of kindness. We bring him family, not as duty, but as love. There was silence for a moment, and the kind that feels sacred. Then soft music began. Some of the young men played drums, while others sang songs that blended beautifully with the rhythm of the desert wind. The women danced gracefully around the firelight, their skirts swirling, their laughter like bells. Eli sat quietly near the edge of the gathering, his heart full. He thought of Mary, how she would have smiled at this sight, how she would have welcomed every one of them with open arms. "You'd love this, Mary," he whispered under his breath. "You'd say the world can still surprise us." Little Hawk, the chief's son, came to sit beside him, holding the small wooden horse Eli had carved days earlier. The boy smiled and pointed to the necklace Eli still wore around his neck. Then he said something softly in his language, and though Eli didn't know the words, he somehow understood. "You're part of us now." The night grew deeper, and the stars filled the sky like silver dust. The fire burned low, and the songs turned gentle and slow. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of sage and smoke. Eli looked around at the faces, people from another world, another life, and yet somehow they all felt like home. Later, when the chief prepared to leave with his warriors, he clasped Eli's hands and said through the translator, "You are no longer alone in this world. These women, these families, like they are your kin now. The desert remembers good hearts." Eli bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Chief. You've given me more than I can ever return." The chief smiled and mounted his horse, his figure glowing softly in the moonlight. "Kindness is the only gift that grows when shared," the translator said as the riders began to move. When the last hoofbeat faded into the night, Eli stood quietly by the fire, watching the new families laugh softly among themselves. Some had already started preparing sleeping mats near the cabin, while others tended to the animals or softly sang to the children. The land that had once been empty was now alive, a place of warmth and laughter. For the first time in years, Eli felt something deep in his soul. Not just peace, but belonging. He realized the chief's words had been true. He would never be alone again. And as he looked up at the endless Arizona sky, filled with stars that seemed to dance above his little farm, Eli whispered a simple prayer of thanks, for friendship, for kindness, and for the unexpected way life could bring light into even the loneliest of hearts. The days that followed were unlike anything Eli Turner had ever known. The quiet farm that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter, music, and life. Morning began not with the lonely sound of a rooster crowing, but with the hum of voices and the soft chatter of many hands at work. The Apache women who had stayed at his homestead brought color and energy into every corner of his world. They swept the dust from the porch, decorated the house with bright woven blankets, and taught Eli how to make bread from corn flour. In return, Eli showed them how to plant vegetables, milk the cows, and fix the wooden fence that always seemed to break in the wind. At first, it all felt strange to him. He wasn't used to so much company. He had spent years alone, speaking mostly to his animals and the wind. But now, every time he stepped outside, someone was humming a tune, laughing with a neighbor, or tending to the growing garden. It was as if the desert itself had come alive, warmed by their presence. One of the older women, Nokoma, took it upon herself to manage the household. She was wise and patient, and she treated Eli like a brother rather than a stranger. "You work too hard," she told him one morning in careful English as he lifted a heavy water barrel. "Now many hands. You rest sometimes." Eli chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Rest? I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I stopped working." Nokoma smiled knowingly. "Then work with laughter," she said simply. And that was exactly what Eli began to do. Slowly he learned to enjoy the small things again, the way sunlight glowed through the cottonwood leaves, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the sound of people singing softly as they cooked dinner outside. The chief's son, Little Hawk, visited often. He had grown stronger since his accident, and every time he came, he brought a small gift, a carved feather, a painted stone, or dried herbs from the canyon. He would sit by the fire with Eli, and even though they didn't share the same language, they shared smiles, gestures, and laughter. They had become friends bound by something deeper than words. Sometimes the chief himself visited too. He always arrived quietly without warning, as if appearing from the desert wind. He would sit with Eli under the old cottonwood tree where Mary was buried, and the two men would share long silences that spoke louder than speech. Through his translator, the chief once said, "When a man saves a life, he saves more than one heart. My people see your spirit. You belong to this land as much as we do." Eli nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I think maybe you're right, Chief. The land brought us together for a reason." As time passed, Eli's small farm grew into something larger than he ever dreamed. With many hands helping, they built new cabins beside his old one. They dug an extra well, planted fruit trees, and even made a small corral for horses. Laughter filled the air from dawn till dusk. Children ran through the fields, chasing chickens and singing songs in two languages, Apache and English mixed like a melody of two worlds. Eli found himself smiling more each day. He didn't feel lonely anymore. In the evenings, everyone would gather around the fire. Nokoma would tell stories from the old Apache legends, about spirits of the mountains, about stars that guided travelers home, and about the desert that remembered every act of kindness. Sometimes, they asked Eli to tell a story in return. He would talk about his early days on the frontier, about Mary, about the time he got lost in a sandstorm and found his way back by following the sound of frogs near a creek. The listeners would nod and laugh softly, their faces glowing in the firelight. Eli's heart would swell during those moments. He realized that although his wife was gone, he hadn't truly lost family. He had just found it again in a different form. One evening, many months later, Chief Greyhawk arrived once more. This time he brought his son and a group of elders. The sunset burned red and gold across the horizon, and the air was warm and still. Eli welcomed them with open arms and a wide smile. After everyone was seated, the chief stood and spoke slowly. The translator repeated his words with care. When the desert was young, the Great Spirit said that hearts are like rivers. They must flow, or they will turn to dust. You, Eli Turner, opened your heart to my son. You gave him life when the desert could have taken it. You made two rivers meet, and now they flow together. Eli bowed his head respectfully. I didn't do anything grand, Chief. I just did what any man should do. The chief smiled. That is what makes it grand, came the translation. The people around them murmured in agreement. The chief reached into a small pouch and brought out a carved piece of wood, a symbol of unity, painted with the shapes of a hawk and a plow. He handed it to Eli. For you, said the translator. For the man who planted friendship in the desert. Eli accepted it with deep emotion. Thank you, my friend. I'll treasure this always. That night they celebrated under a sky full of stars. The air was filled with song, drums, and gentle laughter. The chief and his people sang ancient tunes, and Eli joined by tapping his hand softly to the rhythm. He didn't know the words, but he knew the feeling, the joy of belonging. Later, when the fire burned low and the guests had gone to rest, Eli sat alone beneath the cottonwood tree. The stars shimmered above him like scattered silver dust. He looked out over the land, his land, and saw life everywhere. A place once silent was now alive with love, friendship, and hope. He thought of Mary and whispered to the night, I wish you could see this love. The home we dreamed of, it's real now. It's full of life. The tree rustled softly in the wind, and Eli felt deep in his heart that she could indeed see. As the years passed, Eli grew older, but never lonely again. The women he had welcomed became like daughters and sisters to him. The young men of the Apache tribe visited often to help with the harvest and repairs. Children grew up calling him Grandfather Eli. His little farm became a small community, a symbol of peace between two worlds that once lived apart. People from nearby towns began to visit too. They came to trade goods, share stories, or simply listen to the songs that filled the desert nights. They spoke of the farmer who had once lived alone, who had saved an Apache boy and received 15 brides, yet asked for nothing in return. And so the story spread far and wide. Travelers carried it from one settlement to another. They called it the legend of Greyhawk's debt. But for Eli, it wasn't about debts or rewards. It was about hearts. How one small act of kindness could echo across years, across people, and even across cultures. He often said to the children, "When you do good, you plant a seed. You might forget about it, but someday it grows into a tree that gives shade to someone you've never met." The children would nod thoughtfully, not yet understanding but remembering his words. One cool evening, many years later, the chief returned for the last time. He was older now, his hair streaked with silver. The two men sat together under the cottonwood tree, the same spot where they had first spoken years before. Through the translator, the chief said softly, "I will soon join the ancestors, but my son and his children will always remember you. You are part of our story now." Eli smiled. "And you're part of mine." They clasped hands, two old friends connected by a moment of compassion that had blossomed into a lifetime of peace. When the chief and his people rode away for the final time, Eli watched them until they disappeared behind the red hills. He stood there for a long moment, the wind brushing gently against his face, and whispered, "Good journey, my friend." Years later, when Eli's time came, the people he had loved, both Apache and settler, gathered under the great cottonwood tree to honor him. They sang songs of peace, and they told stories of the man who had once lived alone, but had turned loneliness into friendship. The turquoise necklace still hung in his cabin window, shining brightly in the morning sun, and nearby Little Hawk, now a grown man, placed a new carving beside it, a small wooden horse, the same as the one Eli had once made for him long ago. The desert kept their story alive. Travelers passing through would hear the tale from locals and smile in wonder. They said that on still nights when the stars glowed bright above the Arizona plains, you could almost hear laughter drifting from the cottonwood tree, the laughter of a lonely farmer who was lonely no more. And so, the legend lived on, not just as a story of a farmer and a chief, but as a timeless reminder that kindness once given never fades. It travels on like the wind, soft, endless, and full of life.